Then I would like to introduce our first presenter, who's Sara Brosché, who's actually a graduate from the University of Gothenburg in environmental science. She is the science advisor at IPEN, which you can explain a little bit more to us what that is. But she will present to us, and it's actually the first time she presents this, a report she has recently written also for SAICM on women, chemicals, and the SDGs. So welcome, Sara.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be able to present the report as well, even though it's going to be a very light touch, not to take too much time. All right. And here we go. So let's see here. So as mentioned by Daniel, I'm an advisor to IPEN, which is a global network of non-profit public interest civil society organizations around the world. We have participating organizations in around 125 countries right now. And the joint mission is a toxic-free future for all. And with the network setup, we can link local, regional, and global efforts to prevent harm from chemicals and waste. So this report is developed in collaboration with the UN Environment Programme. It was developed as an output under a project that is funded by the Global Environment Facility, and that is executed by the SAICM Secretariat at the UN Environment Programme. The short title of the project is the SAICM project, but its real name is the Global Best Practices on Emerging Chemical Policy Issues of Concern under the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management. And there you have what SAICM means. It's also produced with co-finance for the Swedish government, but I want to be clear with that responsibility for the content in the report, as well as this presentation and opinions, that lies entirely with IPEN. And also added some links at the bottom of the page if you want to look more at the project and at SAICM itself. Some of you might wonder why it's women and not gender that's on the title. And that is because looking into these issues at a global scale, there are of course local variations, different countries, different regions and so on. But looking globally, women are the most impacted gender. And before I get into the light touch on the report, I think it's important that you know what I mean with different terms. And when it comes to gender, that is a complex term that encompasses quite a lot, but it refers to socially constructed norms, roles, opportunities that are associated with women and men and being male or female. And that includes expressions, identities, and so on. These are just a few examples. There are much more that is included in the term, but it's also a changeable identity. It can vary across time, can vary across where you are and who you're with. The other term we use in the report is biological sex, and that refers to the biological characteristics that are used to define humans as female or male. So that could be the chromosomes, hormones, and of course, anatomy. But I also want to note that even though I'm going to generalize a lot in the presentation and in the report, because I have to do that basically, these are not fixed categories. You don't have this is one thing, this is the other. You have them on a scale, and that's really important to take with you. The report builds on looking at two different aspects relating to gender and biological sex. So the first is gender differentiated exposure. What is that? Well, looking at gender issues, so the socially constructed norms and so on, these are factors that can actually contribute to if you're exposed to hazardous chemicals and how much. Because gender in many countries will define or decide for you what type of work you can do when it comes to occupations, work tasks. It can also have an impact if you can read and write, the level of education that you have. It could also impact how much personal care products you use, which types, do you use makeup, what type of makeup, and so on. It also impacts in many countries who actually do the cleaning at home, because that would also mean that you might be exposed to chemicals in cleaning products. There are more, of course, as always, but these are a few examples. And if you then look at the 6 differentiated effects, so having to do with biological sex, that can then have an impact on what those effects are when you're exposed to hazardous chemicals. Because many different biological factors can impact this, and that has to do with body size, amount of body fat, your hormone system, and the levels of hormones that you have, to mention a few. And when it comes to women, you also have the reproductive cycle, which is specific to women. And you also have certain life stages that are specific to women. You have pregnancy, if you're nursing a child, if you're in menopause, and so on. That can actually also influence the effect. So you can be more or less sensitive to certain chemicals in different life stages. One other thing that is important is that women are the ones that carry the next generation. So that means that while it might not be an impact specifically on the woman, it can impact the pregnancy and the developing fetus. So that means that you can have chemicals that are transferred both when you're pregnant, but also during breastfeeding. And there is one more aspect that I wanted to raise, and that is that in some countries and some women actually know that they have been exposed to chemicals that accumulate in the body, like lead, like mercury, like persistent organic pollutants. And that means that that can actually impact your life decisions, because you don't know if it's safe to have children even. But I also want to make sure that we're not only looking at these issues as a matter of impact, as sort of the victim angle, because women are also leading the way to change. So even though we see, again, on a global scale, that women have less access to decision-making, even around their own working environments, women are active on all levels to make this change. So the report is coupled both to the SAICM emerging policy issues and the Sustainable Development Goals. And why? Why is this important? Well, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you have one box for gender equality, and then you don't have one for chemicals and waste, but you do have one for responsible consumption and production that includes aspects of chemicals and waste. But if you start looking into also the other goals, you will see that actually addressing gender, chemicals, and waste are integral to so many of the other goals and targets. I have added a few goals and targets here and a few of the emerging policy issues. There are 4 more that just didn't make, the slide is busy enough. So these are 4 more emerging policy issues. But just to explain that, what I mean with this slide is that if you look at target 4 and target 4, how can you have sustainable food production if you're using highly hazardous pesticide to produce that food? Or how can you reduce illness and death from hazardous chemicals and pollution if you don't do anything about endocrine disrupting chemicals? Can you have clean water if you have PFAS, perfluorinated chemicals in it? Or how can you have safe working environments when workers are exposed to hazardous substances within the life cycle of electronics? And so on. There are, again, a number of more examples that you can look at for all the emerging policy issues, but this is just to give you an idea of the different aspects that the report goes into. With the time I have, I wanted to share one example of what this means in practice. And I wanted to choose highly hazardous pesticides because there is a very clear gender angle in this. There is a gender dimension that is clear, but it's also an issue where there is so much fantastic work going on in communities, in countries, in regions to do something about this issue. So we can look at that as well. The first question, I'm sure, is what is highly hazardous pesticides? Well, there is actually no internationally, globally agreed list that all countries have signed on to. But I would highly recommend that you have a look at the list that's been put together by the Pesticide Action Network. I've added the web link there, it's just updated. They have looked at pesticides in use and looked at regional agreed or internationally agreed criteria to see which would be classified as highly hazardous. And just to make sure you understand, it's not only DDT or sort of the really, really bad ones that we know of that are actually classified like this. There are some really well-known names here, chlorpyrifos and glyphosate or SEM. This is also important because pesticides overall is some of the largest chemical exposure in low and middle income countries. And this, if we're talking inequalities, I also have to mention that this is made worse by the fact that there are practices of also producing and exporting pesticides that are banned in high income countries, but can still be exported. So that means that you will get some of the worst ones being exported to countries that have less capacity to deal with them. So looking at pesticides and this gender differentiated exposure, first we have to see just that exposure to pesticides can occur in so many ways. These are some examples. It will be all from preparation, you use it, you dispose of the remnants or the waste, you have to clean your equipment, maybe you live close to an agriculture area, you will have spray drift, or maybe you will enter into a field that would just been treated, or even treated crops that are not being cleaned properly. As a general rule, women are in many types of occupations, and this is true also for agriculture, that women are tasked with the sort of less physically demanding tasks. So that could be preparing the pesticide in this case, that could also be taking care of the waste, cleaning the equipment, taking care of the crops, things like that. And all of this is not seen as a risk, so you will not have any safety equipment. But also many women do work directly in the fields, most cases, many cases, without any protective equipment. And there are scientific studies that show clearly that you will have higher pesticide exposure in women, and that is coupled to higher illiteracy rates and lower awareness of health hazards. So here you have two types of gender dimensions. You have the type of work that you conduct, but also you have the level of education and literacy. Looking at the differentiated effects of that exposure, there are some clear gender or angles associated with being a woman. Many pesticides are endocrine disrupting chemicals. So that means that they will interfere with your hormone system, and that will have specific impacts in women. Again, there are many different types of health effects from pesticides, but some of the more well-known ones is if you're exposed during pregnancy, that can lead to outcomes such as miscarriage, birth defects, developmental effects, and so on. And there are also a range of pesticides that have been associated with the development of breast cancer, for example. But also to come back to this, which I think is really an important message here, and that is women are also leading the way to a more equal future and also to a safer future. So when it comes to pesticides, I would highly recommend that you go into the Pesticide Action Network website for Asia Pacific and look at the work that's being done there with rural communities and women in agriculture there. These are fantastic, uplifting stories. It's really amazing. I also can recommend IPEN's website and our Women and Chemicals section of the website. I took a screen dump here of a video that is about a panel where people from groups working on the ground with women groups and fostering women leadership, supporting women leadership, tell their stories. Very, very, very exciting work and very important work.
So this is a one minute remark, Sara?
That's perfect, because this is also my final slide. I There are many recommendations in the report, some very specific to specific emerging policy issues, but I wanted to add just a few of the general ones. Some seem quite obvious, such as women have to have full effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision making in all areas of life. But also it's important that there is high-level political recognition of the importance of addressing inequalities related to women in chemicals. For its own sake, but also we will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals unless we do that. There should be policies adopted that focuses on phasing out hazardous chemicals with a priority for the ones that have a high impact on women, and also preventing pregnant women from working with hazardous chemicals. And that's policies, government policies, industry policies, procurement policies, what have you. And there also needs to be more data. There is substantially amount of evidence, but it's skewed towards Western countries right now. And so there needs to be more data from low and middle income countries, and that needs to be made publicly available. It has to be clear both the gender and biological sex dimension of that data, so you can look at the different aspects of this issue. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. And I added my contact details if you want to email me and ask questions afterwards or anything like that. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sara. Of course, this report could be worthy of a seminar on its own, and it was very brief. But if we stay with your example of highly hazardous pesticides, could you say something on what would the policy implications be if you take a gender perspective?
Well, there is a number of different aspects that I would look at. First of all, this is not associated with gender, but there has to be policies around highly hazardous pesticides needs to be banned overall. That would improve everyone's life that are exposed to them. So that's not gender related, but when it comes to these gender dimension, when it comes to work, when it comes to literacy and so on, the more you improve equality, the more you will address those issues as well. And of course, also looking at the specific impacts on women to make sure that you protect women, and especially pregnant women, women of childbearing age. So those are some quite general points. Okay,
thank you. We have one comment question in the chat, see, and it's on the need to the chemical excessiveness and the need to measure to control, including reduction at source. Kindly your thoughts from Mahmoud Kwaya.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to look at different chemicals and see what type of impact they have, like the endocrine disrupting chemicals, for example. We know that they can have an impact at very low levels. So looking at these, you have to start with, when we talk about excessive exposure, for example, endocrine disrupting chemicals, it's difficult or even impossible to assess what that would be, I would say. So starting with the ones that have effects at the lowest levels, I would say is an important first step, and then start looking into the different types of chemicals.
Okay, thank you, Sara. We will get back to you in the discussion, and now we will proceed. And I'm happy to introduce Dayna Scott, who is Associate Professor in Environmental Law at York University in Canada. And we are most happy to have you here at our seminar. So welcome. And she will present on a feminist political economy of pollution.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And I want to say thank you to the organizers, including Julia and Lena, and to Sara for the opportunity to consider this report. which has really spurred me to take account of where the thinking on this topic has moved in the past couple of years, since I was actively involved in a major law reform effort in Canada. So in 2016, the Canadian government, Liberal majority, was said to be open to reforming its main toxics law, which is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And people said the time was right, the political will was there, it was a once in a generation opportunity. And so many of us were convinced to write briefs and give testimony. We urged the parliamentary committee to insert an environmental justice lens into the law, to move to hazard-based rather than risk-based assessments for chemicals, to implement gender disaggregation and exposure assessments, to insert what we call a safe substitution principle. And the committee accepted almost all of those recommendations. That was the good news. On the other hand, the minister replied with platitudes, and exactly 0 of those things have been achieved 4 years later. So I could engage in an exposition on why, but most of those are uninteresting and unsurprising domestic political pressures. And so instead, what I want to focus on today are the broader theoretical influences that I believe should be shaping our activism. So I'm going to argue for a reorientation of our analytics and our ethics, such that we might be able to make inroads on anti-toxics movement building for the long run. Okay, so as we've heard, millions of tons of toxic synthetic materials are created, processed, released as effluent, and inserted into consumer goods every year. The toxic exposures that derive from those emissions result from what I'm going to say is an endemic logic to extractivism, one that cannot be overcome simply by the safe use and disposal of chemicals. In other words, we need to think about the way that the emissions and the exposures are not just trailing in the wake of extractive industries, but they're actually built into those systems, and they're fueled by the same hierarchies of gender, race, indigeneity, etc. So in order to overcome those dynamics, we need to sharpen our analytics and expand our ethics. As the IPEN report effectively demonstrates, the risks associated with toxic chemical exposures, even though they're pervasive and widespread, are also decidedly uneven in their distribution. Their distribution varies along very familiar social gradients, with disproportionate burdens landing on low-income, racialized, and Indigenous communities. And at the same time, the effects of those exposures and the burden of managing them seem mostly to land on the shoulders of women. What the report does very well is to expose how gender affects health through those various socially prescribed roles, behaviors, the differential levels of authority and control, while also not dismissing the biological differences typically attributed to sex. I agree that the use of a gender lens is important to improve conditions of environmental health, and that it must be sensitive not only to differences in socio-cultural constructions of gender, but also to differences in biologies. And this does not necessarily entail subscribing to gender binaries, as Sara has noted, nor does it mean that in order to recognize people's specific embodied needs and experiences and account for biological differences, we need to go down the familiar path towards claims of vulnerability that ultimately undermine people's agency and autonomy. The IPEN report both reflects and advances the contemporary discourse and literature on gender and environmental health by taking the further step of including access to decision-making, to validate the ways that gender affects the distribution of power and resources in society, and consequently influences opportunities to engage with policy reform. Oops. So we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking this affects women mostly in the global south. And what I wanted to just highlight here is a recent series by the Globe and Mail, a national newspaper in Canada, which found that despite the fact that Canada passed equal pay legislation in 1951, women overtook men among university graduates 3 decades ago, and women represent just under half the workforce. Men still dramatically outnumber, out-earn, and outrank women across almost all sectors, and especially in respect of what they call the, quote, power positions. It's by now recognized, even by the mainstream, that health disparities are structured, reinforced, and compounded by gender factors. COVID-19 and the she-cession in its aftermath is an obvious example of this. The task moving forward that I think all of us on this panel share is to expand our collective understanding of the links between social inequity, environmental risks, and the gendered division of health burdens. So the kinds of understandings that Sara in the IPEN report explains, this is the diffuse, nuanced, and chronic effects of chemicals on our bodies, provoke a direct challenge to the competing notion of thresholds that anchors toxicology and forms the bedrock of our juridical regimes to govern chemicals. The prevailing paradigm, the dose makes the poison, is firmly embedded in a variety of environmental laws, at least for whole categories of key chemicals. We're finding in many cases where we thought there were thresholds for health effects, there actually may not be. This means that tinkering at the margins of those regulatory regimes by inserting reference to the precautionary principle and safe substitution and considering gender aggregated exposure data, even perhaps by implementing reverse onus schemes, may still not make a dent in the toxic world we inhabit. This will happen only once we decide together to begin reconstructing the architecture of those regulatory regimes. So the theoretical foundation I'm developing is framed as a feminist political economy of pollution. In this conception, political economy is closely related to an environmental justice framework, interrogating systemic issues of power and ownership, relating to who profits from and exerts exploitative control over ecological resources, economic capital, and social labor. But we also widen the scope to allow consideration of how exploitative relationships between industrial actors and marginalized workers transcend into people's everyday physical realities, how those categories are breaking down or being challenged, and how the continuities in this exploitation extend from extractive sites right into our cities, our homes, and our bodies across all sectors. So just to begin with our analytics, here we have to pay attention to scale in a way that's material and spatial and is always switching between the focus between micro and macro perspectives. So just to give you one example, a doctoral student I'm supervising, Rena Shaden, has completed a project that began with a body mapping exercise by a group of women working in nail salons in Toronto, mainly Vietnamese newcomers. But as she traced the ingredients in a typical brand of nail polish, her analysis expanded out to encompass the facilities that produce the solvents they contain, with attention to the people living in the communities that have to breathe the air pollution released in the production of those solvents, including in this case, the Anishinaabe people of Aamjiwnaang First Nation, which is downwind of Canada's Chemical Valley. And then Rena further tied the production of those solvents to the whole industrial ecosystem of the petrochemical complex, starting with the extraction, transport, and refining of petroleum, a process which produces byproducts that become the inputs for further chemical manufacture. These are complex, nonlinear chains of causality at multiple scales of analyses, reaching across municipal, state, and global levels of governance. In fact, in a recent article Rena published with Michelle Murphy in Catalyst, the authors note how it's common today to find endocrine disrupting chemicals described as a problem of packaging, plastics, or consumer goods, and to characterize their effects as a problem of bodily damage, as injury or alteration to the reproductive and sexual development of individuals. In fact, across a variety of different contributions, critical scholars of toxics are trying to push past this frame to move beyond the individualized, molecularized, damage-centered, and body-centered frames in order to expose the underlying architecture, so that we can see that structures of settler colonialism and racial capitalism drive oil extraction and refining, and then work to distribute the associated emissions and exposures to chemicals. As Max Liboiron says, pollution is colonialism. It's largely state-sanctioned environmental violence that disrupts the land-body relation. So this is one analytical move from micro to macro across space. A second move is in relation to thinking across time. So here I've highlighted where Rob Nixon says the industrial particulates and effluents that live on in our environmental elements we inhabit and in our very bodies, epidemiologically and ecology, are never our simple contemporaries. In other words, the pollution harms that are body altering and generational in character produce afflictions experienced today, cancer, reproductive problems, developmental difficulties, that could be tied to presently occurring continuing exposures or could be manifestations of exposures long past. As Vanessa Agard-Jones has demonstrated, many of these chemicals persist in a geological span that exceeds the timescale of the human species, meaning their legacies will characterize the planet into the distant future. We have to confront the prospect of today's chemical consumption reaching forward into future generations. We're familiar by now with this in the context of climate change, but less critical analysis has taken place in relation to toxics. So increasing attention to these possible intergenerational impacts of everyday chemical exposures and the related field of epigenetics, which is mentioned briefly in the IPEN report, inserts a pervasive uncertainty to the question of regulatory control. The juridical logics we continue to employ utterly fail to capture these dimensions.
So 1 minute left, Dayna.
Okay, good. And finally, on to our ethics. So as we focus our attention on climate change and regimes for managing extraction, it would be easy for us to lose sight of the fact that extraction articulates with an expanding sphere of activities that many of us living modern lives in urban centers don't necessarily see as extractivist, using our computers and our phones, buying a new sofa, or getting a manicure. But what we need to begin to do is to identify the interconnected extractive logics. Late last year, in a landmark decision, a UK coroner ruled that air pollution contributed to 9-year-old Ella Kissy Deborah's death. She lived on the bus route, suffered from severe asthma, and was hospitalized 27 times in the last years of her life. In 2013, she died in hospital after an asthma attack. When we disconnect sites of consumption, the city, the home, the body, from sites of literal extraction, the mines, the tar sands, the fracking, and even from those sites of production in between, the chemical complex, the plastics manufacturing hub, the suburban tech cluster, we gloss over the complex political economies such that we cast both city dwellers and those on the fence lines as passive participants at best, and at worst, as mere victims. Ordinary people all along the extractive frontier lose agency in this conception. Instead, the obvious movement of toxics out of consumer goods and into our bodies across borders, environments, and economies provides a rationale for why we must extend out our spheres of political and ethical responsibility from the level of the individual or family to cover broader ecosystems and communities. The expanded sphere of ethical and political responsibility thus encompasses the health of workers in the places that produce the consumer goods we enjoy, and the people living metaphorically downstream of those facilities, and everyone along the chain. The kind of control we seek is also different. Instead of judging our inability to achieve control over exposures as fault or failure, we must concede and relinquish the quest for perfect control of a false boundary, and instead seek to consciously expand our sphere of responsibility. We must seek to be more broadly and creatively responsible for chemical production and pollution, even in the face of very little control. I think I'll leave it at there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dayna, so much for this reflection, and it's quite challenging picture you paint to us on how to reconstruct or think around that architecture for regulatory regimes in this area. So if you got another go on this more kind of immediate regulatory changes in Canada, what would your kind of suggestion be to the minister to move in this direction? You would try to put down some more tangible next steps.
Yeah, I think I would be trying for many of the same things, and these are the regulatory changes that people are fighting for in many jurisdictions, right? I think maybe the most significant one is the reverse onus. We don't have that yet in Canada or the US. We have the situation where people have to prove that the chemical is harmful before any regulatory action can be taken against it. I think obviously the regrettable substitutions issue is a big problem, right? This is where evidence finally accumulates with respect to one particular chemical of concern, such to get the approval taken away, and industry instantly replaces it with a very similar substitute that probably has the same environmental and health effects, but doesn't have the same body of evidence proving those effects. You know, but the difficulty is that, of course, the politicians are looking for something quick they can change in a law without changing the overall structure of the law. And that's the problem I've been trying to point some attention to.
Thanks, Dayna. Anything in the chat, Julia, for Dayna?
I think we have some questions, but they are for all of the speakers. So I would suggest that we save them for the panel, and then we move on to Norah.
Okay, fair enough. Then we'll move on with the third presentation, and we will then introduce Norah MacKendrick, who is an associate professor of sociology at Rutgers University in the US. And she will talk under the heading Precautionary Consumption. So welcome.
Right. Thank you very much for having me, for the invitation. And thank you to Sara and Dayna for setting the stage with some compelling evidence and arguments for rethinking how we make sense of pollution in bodies. I was asked to talk specifically about how the problem of global long-term persistent contamination plays out in the lives of everyday women. And by women, I'm speaking of, cisgender, largely middle-class women in the industrialized world. And I've done work with women in Canada and the US. So let's take a step back for a moment before I get into that, just to think about how some of these issues captured public attention. So this is the cover of the book, Our Stolen Future, published in 1996. It raised the alarm about the impact of chemicals on human health, the environment, and specifically human fertility. As the authors write, children have the right to be born chemical-free. This book helped to launch other campaigns by environmental groups in the United States. For example, the Environmental Working Group is a major one here in the US. This is a full-page ad that was run in the New York Times in 2002, drawing attention to carcinogens and endocrine disruptors in fragrances. And you see here from the image and the titles that the emphasis here is on impacts on the child, with the mother as the conduit for chemical harm. And this is from a book published by Healthy Child, Healthy World, and another environmental group here in the US, again using the same sort of framing of drawing women's attention to how they're, in this photo, it seems rather selfish, self-care, personal care routines can be harming the fetus, urging women to make better choices for the health of their children. These same messages are being carried through policy briefs and position statements. So this is coming from the President's Cancer Panel of 2010. Drawing attention to, again, to how women are conduits of chemical harm. So in one part of the report, the authors write that while all Americans now carry many foreign chemicals in their bodies, women often have higher levels of toxic and hormone disrupting substances than do men. And a phrase that captured the attention of the news media here was, to a disturbing extent, babies are born pre-polluted. This language really borrowed from environmental activism campaigns here in the US where that tested cord blood to show that infants at birth carry a toxic load from their parents' environmental exposures. So as we know, and as these reports show, and as we've heard today, the problem of pollution in bodies and threats to children's health and threats to our fertility, this is a structural problem. This is a problem, as Dayna pointed out, of a political economy. It's global, it relates to extraction. It can't be easily narrowed down to any single individual thing. Yet, as much as this problem is acknowledged to be structural, the response is highly individualized. In fact, we see this appeal to individuals, and not just any individuals, but women and mothers, to do something about chemical pollution. As we've heard, the efforts to reform chemical regulation have stalled, they're non-existent, or they've been rolled back if we think about what's happening here in the United States. And under those conditions, the responsibility of individual consumers, and women especially, becomes heightened and even more concentrated. And this is ideological. It relates to social expectations of who should invest in children's futures, where women are expected to make the best decisions for their future child or their current families. Men and fathers aren't completely absent from the conversation, but they're barely relevant. They're considered useful in the very early stages of this reproductive equation, as we call it in sociology, basically at conception. And then if they're involved at all throughout the child's life course, they're obstacles, in other words, not making the right shopping decision, or they're helpers, assisting the mother in making the right choices for the right product and right ways of feeding the child. It's ideological in another sense too, in that this perfectly corresponds to neoliberal policy regimes, where government rolls back regulation and puts the onus on consumers and citizens to make the proper choices. And in the United States, as in Canada, as Dayna also mentioned, we employ something that I call the safe until sorry approach. This means that evidence of harm has to accumulate to a particular threshold that is not transparent to members of the public. When it reaches this threshold of appropriate evidence of harm, then the regulatory mechanisms begin to click into place. But until then, consumers are on their own to make the right decision, to try to avoid personal exposure. So how did I come up with this term precautionary consumption? Well, I'm comparing it in large part to the precautionary principle, which I think for those of you in Sweden and in Western Europe, this is very familiar to you. So it's a policy ethic that prioritizes the protection of human health and the environment, even if evidence of harm is inconclusive. So the onus is on proving that something is safe. And we have quite the opposite here in Canada and the US. This has been implemented in the North Sea agreements on pollution and hazardous substances, global agreements on ozone depleting substances, and REACH, the major piece of chemical regulation in the European Union in 2007. Under the precautionary principle, government has a responsibility to act ahead of full scientific certainty. So we don't have that same sort of threshold of evidence of harm that we do elsewhere. In the United States and in Canada, we don't have the institutionalization of the precautionary principle in our environmental policies, laws, and regulation. So by default, we have what I call precautionary consumption. And that means that each individual shopper has to make their own precautionary decisions to decide, will they buy the regular hand soap that might have sodium lauryl sulfate or triclosan, or do they buy the eco-friendly and green product that does not have these substances? And of course, on the store shelf, both products are available, and it's up to the consumer to decide which one he or she will buy and to read the label and to understand what that label means. So under precautionary consumption, consumers have to become savvy shoppers to avoid chemical risks, and it becomes the default option in capitalist economies with lax regulation. When you're not protecting human health and you're not protecting the environment, the onus is on individuals. Most often it's women who are precautionary consumers, of course, not exclusively. I've certainly studied families where men were making these decisions, but most often it's women who are making the grocery list, who are learning about this even before they intend to start a family. So how do mothers experience precautionary consumption? And my research comes from a fairly privileged set of women, if we're thinking about this in a global perspective. So these are women living in urban areas. They tend to be middle class, they're professional, they had their children, after finishing a college or university degree. So for these women, there's the sense, even before they have children, but particularly after their children are born, that a healthy childhood is compromised even before life begins. So they're very much aware that chemical exposures happen in utero. They see feeding and shopping for children as high stakes work. They see it as determining whether their child will develop cancer, a cognitive problem, or become obese or unhealthy. These were things that women in my interviews have mentioned as worries they have about the way they're feeding their child. This is work that's expensive. These products cost more than conventional products. It's time consuming, and at times it's contradictory. And the women I've interviewed are very much aware of these contradictions. They speak of living in an urban area with high levels of air pollution while shelling out all kinds of money on organic and non-toxic products and wondering what's the point when exposure is happening through air and sometimes water and soil. For the women I've interviewed who have more resources, they're more likely to talk about precautionary consumption as something that's rewarding. So they find that in the end, they're happy that they have access to these choices and they're making the right decisions. But for women with fewer resources, so with less money, less time, more difficulty accessing the right stores to buy the right products, they're more likely to find it pointless and kind of give up. So just a few quotes from some of my interviews. So this is from Brenda, who is a mother in Toronto, and she's talking about the different stages of awareness she had as she, at conception through to feeding her child her first solid foods. And she says, well, I'm pregnant, so it's better for the baby. And then when the baby was born, I thought, well, it's better for her breastfeeding. And now I also feed her all organic food. So this responsibility for precautionary consumption, as I'm trying to show with this quote, it extends through the reproductive life course. And many women are now advised to begin thinking about their chemical exposures prior to having children. This is a quote from Fiona, a mother in New York City. And here she's thinking specifically about future disease. She's saying, if I give him this, and here she's talking about a conventional pepper, a sweet pepper that might have a high level of pesticide residue on it. Is he going to be more likely to get cancer, a childhood cancer or cancer when he's 80? So these are the things she's thinking about as she's feeding her child. She also says, we don't know what the impact of these chemicals will be for him 10 years from now, and also about the early onset of puberty and things like that. So she's thinking ahead, she's thinking of the future.
This is Norah.
Okay. This is a middle-class project. And what I mean by that is if you have middle-class resources, it's much easier to do precautionary consumption and to feel that it's an accomplishment, that it's a part of being a good mother. If you don't have those resources, it's much more difficult and much more fraught. So Dahlia, who is on food stamps, talked about wanting to buy organic food for her child, but having a discussion with her husband about whether that was the right decision, whether they had enough money to do so. Christine, who's low income and had at one time been on food stamps, learned how to create a very comprehensive precautionary consumer regime, but it took a great deal of time for her. She would go to the stores, she would look at flyers, and she shopped at many different stores to save as much money as possible. So it's very time consuming, very expensive. So bringing this all together and thinking about the IPEN report and Dayna's talk, and then what's happening on the ground with this particular subset of mothers, we have, industrial expansion, which is global, long-term. We have the circulation of contaminants and poor regulatory oversight, which creates this ubiquitous environmental pollution. Combined with these gender ideologies that position women as primarily responsible for children's futures. We have the neoliberal expansion of the regulatory regimes, the regulatory rollbacks, and the growth in this market of non-toxic products. And at the same time, we have the public health education of women to educate them and train them to become better consumers as a sort of workaround around these global environmental problems. And this, of course, leads to precautionary consumption. And I don't feel particularly optimistic that we will see any forces in the near or long term that will disrupt this. We're certainly not seeing signs of it here in the United States, and as Dayna mentioned, as well in Canada. And what I believe is required are global agreements that bring together all of these regulatory bodies and these corporations that are producing these substances. But we can also talk about that in the Q&A. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We have a question for you here in the chat around children's vulnerability. Would the exposure thresholds limits, if strictly set with regards to children's vulnerability rather than the usual adult ones, that drastically reduced exposure to the children and the public in general? Your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. So let me see if I can see the question. Yeah, so if in some cases that's been done. So if we think about pesticide regulation in the United States, starting in the mid-1990s, regulatory bodies began to consider the special vulnerability of children in thinking about what would be acceptable pesticide residues in food. And what this did was it did improve pesticide regulation in the United States, but only to a certain extent. And it certainly did not protect farm workers and their families. And we still have a major problem in the United States of pesticide drift. So the spraying of pesticides affecting farm workers and families who tend to live near the fields where people are working. So it created some improvement. So that is important, but it was not enough to really reform pesticide regulation.
So do you see any changes with the new administration in terms of policy in this around toxics in the US, or are you moving away from precautionary consumption as a strategy, or do you see any kind of more structural changes coming?
Well, we were, the United States was on track to reform chemical regulation. And this happened just before the election of Donald Trump, where the dominant policy framework was reformed in such a way, didn't use the language of the precautionary principle, but it leaned heavily on some of those ideas. And of course, with the election of Trump, the EPA was reorganized. New people were put in charge, including representatives from the chemical industry and chemical lobbyists. And since then, that regulation has been rolled back. Now, Biden is in a position to strengthen that regulation again and adhere to the original promises that in fact he was part of under his administration as vice president. So there's certainly the potential, it's just too early to say. And the EPA will change for the better under Biden, but these things take time. So we could very well be in the same situation in 4 years where things look promising and they have regulation back under, you know, they have some momentum, and then we have another election and things might change drastically. So the short answer is it's too early to say.
Yeah, I guess. Thank you very much for your presentation.